All right, says we're live. Hopefully that's true. Can you ladies? Are we live? Just after our experience from last week, I want to verify that it's broadcasting and it's working.
Yeah.
You there? All right. Good to see the heads nodding. So, good morning. I got quite a crew in here with me this morning. I've got two lovely helpers. So both Heather and Rachel are here with me. I'm probably going to get Rachel to slide around over onto this side since I don't need two producers. I might as well have a guest host and a producer. So it's been a long time since I've had a guest and help. I've got, it takes a lot of help for Lance to handle this, and I've got lots of help this morning. So it's super nice to have the ladies here with me. Actually just got off a call from a dealer asking about why corn's leafing out underground, and Rachel and I had been visiting about that before we went live. So we're adding that to our list of topics this morning. So if you, I've identified, I'm going to say 4 voodoo days, two primary voodoo days for planting this year, and 2 secondary voodoo days. So the worst 2 days to have planted this year so far were probably the 19th of April and the 30th of April, right ahead of the Easter weekend rain. And then I don't know when that rain at the end of the month exactly was, but there was a shower that occurred sometime around May 1st also. And there was a cold snap there. Rachel actually pulled up our emergence risk forecasting tool and was looking at that. We like to look at that and look back when we identify these voodoo days and see if it did a good job predicting those days. And it kind of did, actually. It showed a moderate risk of planting on that April 29th and 30th. Now, an online tool that shows a moderate risk probably ain't going to get anybody to stop planting, and that's not really what we're trying to do with that tool. But when we identify these days that turn out to be, in hindsight, I guess I should have left the planter in the shed on those days. It is nice when we can look back in that tool and see that, okay, it did kind of indicate that it might be a little bit sketchy. And if that happens consistently enough, Rachel and I are probably going to get bolder about saying, no, maybe you shouldn't plant today based on what this is telling us. So we'll see how that goes. But long list of things we want to talk about here this morning. So Rachel, get on over here. So our audience gets to see you too, not just me. You're going to feel like home today because it's going to be dry and hot and windy. It feels like Kansas out there today. Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know how humid it's going to get. You don't have.
Heather's telling me to get closer.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. So yeah, that's actually working good. So good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Rachel was on with me maybe a month or 6 weeks ago or so. Was not as awful as she was anticipating it was, and so she's back.
Yeah, when I volunteered to help, I really thought I'd be over there where Heather is.
Well, I didn't know Heather was going to be here. I thought I told her I was going to be in trouble with you for not telling her that she didn't have to cut. Yeah, that's what she told me.
Heather and I talked.
When she texted me, she says, "Let me in." I'm like, "Oh, I'm in trouble." Heather drove all the way to Monmouth, and she didn't have to. But anyway, the ladies knew what was going on. So once again, the guy thinking the ladies don't know what's going on, that's stupid. Don't do that. They always know what's going on.
That's the real lesson for you.
Yeah. Yes. And I, you guys out there watching, we all need lessons, whether you realize it or not. I've been getting a lot lately myself. So anyway, so thanks for joining this morning, and please ask your questions if you have them. We're going to talk about evaluating stands. We already talked a lot last episode, so if you didn't see the last episode, and if you're wondering why the beans aren't coming up very good, and if you're wondering why the early corn looks better than the early beans, and you're wondering why the beans are so slow, and you're wondering about that kind of stuff, the last episode was kind of dedicated to that. So maybe give that a look if you want to, and we won't rehash all of that. But I do want to talk about, kind of related to that, what can you live with in a soybean stand? And Rachel and I probably have slightly different opinions, and you will have slightly different opinions, and everybody has a slightly different opinion on that topic. And so we'll spend some time on that. I want to talk about some insects to be on the watch for. Talk about it's time to be, believe it or not, time to be post-spraying corn, and very nearly time to be post-spraying soybeans already. That season, I'm a little worried is going to be pretty compressed because of how fast everything went in, and our retail applicators that we often stick up for our retail applicators here on Ask the Agronomist because they have they have a more impossible task than the rest of us do, getting everything done in a way that pleases the government and the label and the customer in a timely fashion, and that's very difficult. And there's a lot of this early April corn is probably, I mean, my mid-April corn here at the farm is V4 ish.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing there's some V5, V6 corn south of here that went in even earlier. That stuff probably should have been posted already. So hopefully you've done that. And if you've got a retail applicator who is encouraging you to let them get started spraying your corn, don't say no, because it's time to start, and perfect timing to get a V5 fungicide on corn, which I'm a big fan of myself. I think Rachel is as well. We are of the opinion that while it's been relatively dry, and while the early April corn didn't struggle as much as it does in some years, the impact of planting date on the incidence of crown rot is very, very strong. And even though the early April corn looks wonderful, and even though it wasn't ever flooded, and even though it came up nicely, I still think we have good potential for crown rot to impact that early planted corn. And you've got a perfect stand in many cases. And what that perfect stand means is you're going to have hopefully a high ear count. And what a high ear count means is it's going to be under a lot of stress during grain fill, especially if we have any weather conditions that cause stress later on. And all of those factors, I think tend to lean towards let's protect that crop the best we can. Let's not get chintzy because it's dry and it looks so good, and you think, oh, it hasn't had any stress, I don't need to worry about that. I think just getting planted early is enough, and you might not say it's stress, but that is the environment that favors the root system getting infected with crown rot pathogens. And if your root system gets infected and you have the right conditions later in the season, that's when you get years like 2021 where the train comes off the tracks, and we have a lot of issues. And I think while a V5 fungicide is not going to prevent that, it does help. It does improve your late season stock quality. It's not a replacement for a VT application. It's in addition to a VT application. But I'll let Rachel give her thoughts on that.
So I agree with Lance. I think one thing that we need to keep in mind when we talk about crown rot, it's very, very well correlated to planting date. So we always see it, not always, but if we see it, it's almost always in our April corn.
Yes,
so we don't always see it in April corn, but we rarely see it in our later planted corn.
And I think it even correlates to, I see more in April 5th corn than I do in April 28th corn. I mean, just the earlier you plant, it's just like SDS and soybeans. It's not a reason not to plant early, but the earlier you plant, the more likely you are to see certain pathogens. And I, this is, you should never say never, in anything in life, but, I don't know that I've ever seen crown rot, at least enough to really be impactful on corn planted after like the 5th of May. I mean, it just almost doesn't happen. And if you've been fighting crown rot, that is my number one recommendation is don't get in a big hurry to plant your corn, because you can really, soybeans, we lose yield potential if we wait till May 5th to plant soybeans. I know this is an arguable point. I know last year we certainly lost yield on May corn, but I've sent up a prayer, actually, Rachel, that the corn planted last week ends up being the best corn. And I was talking.
Yeah, I like later planted.
Yeah, that's why I keep asking her back.
We can agree on this.
Yeah, that's people used to try to make Kal and I get in fights over that because they thought we disagreed with each other, and we really didn't disagree with each other. But Chris was more practical than I am. He knows that farmers love to plant corn early, and so he wasn't going to say anything to discourage that. I like to be a little bit of a contrarian sometimes, and so I No. I think it's charming.
That's right, Lance. Yep.
Other people disagree. So anyway, so I back to the V5 fungicide. So a couple other thoughts on that. If there's always, lots of stuff in the tank at that time. We've generally got Roundup, which has got a ton of surfactants in it. There's sometimes other chemistry that's oil and solvent based. All the fungicides are oil and solvent based. And what I'm leading up to is, and you may have experienced this in the past, typically when you throw a V5 fungicide in, it heats up the mix. So I'm not saying that the little bit of leaf burn that you may cause because of that is going to hurt anything, but it does alarm people sometimes. And if you've been using a particular program for a couple years and you've never seen it do anything, and the only thing you did different was you threw in a V5 fungicide, that's a significant change. And so I don't want to discourage anybody from doing it, but be a little bit cautious with, how much oil and additive, and, you might need a little bit less additional oils and stuff, or just be aware of that. I think, the cuticle on this corn plant is probably fairly thin yet at this point, because up until today, we haven't had a lot of heat. And so stuff's probably fairly succulent. Weeds are going to be easy to kill. They're small. That's when we want to be doing it. So I'm a big proponent of a V5 fungicide. I think every acre of April corn ought to get a V5 fungicide. If you didn't plant your corn till last week, you could probably skip the V5 fungicide if you truly wanted to. But if you've got corn that's already V4, V5, that means you planted it the first half of April. And that would be a really, really wise investment to get a good V5 fungicide on that corn. And so anything else you want to add to that, Rachel?
So I would say, you were talking about, we really don't feel like that's been stressed. It hasn't been cold and wet and set in saturated soil, but we're going to talk a lot about replant. That's all I've done the last, I don't know, 5 days or something like that. Mm-hmm. And we're doing that because we experienced cool conditions, right, cooler than we really probably give it credit for. So right, those cold conditions can actually right, be your stress. And while we both like May planted corn generally, or later planted corn, for logistics reasons, I know that you have to plant earlier sometimes, but you also have to manage accordingly. Right. For SDS, we talk about managing SDS accordingly. Right. We need to think of crown rot. Right. Not saying don't plant early if you have to, but make sure that you're managing accordingly. And I think B5 is one of the easiest ones to throw in.
It is
as far as managing.
It's not as beneficial or essential as the VT application. Yep. But it costs a fraction of the VT application as well, because it's hitching a ride for free essentially. And we're usually recommending a half-ish rate. There are people that are using 3/4 rates. There are a handful of people that are using full rates at V5. But that half rate is certainly beneficial. And most of the positive experiences that people have had with the V5 fungicide have been at that half rate level. That's what most people's experience has been. And that's our standard recommendation. I am a proponent of rate intensification on fungicides. I think especially at VT, we've seen some remarkable benefits from putting on as much as you can stand at VT. So, 10 ounces instead of 8, or 12 instead of 10 on a Delar or Delar Complete typically has lots of benefits. And I'm not, I'll say the same thing about anybody's fungicide. My favorite VT fungicide program would be a full rate of whatever product you choose to use. And, so it's not just the Delaro products that we see benefits out of going up to that higher rate. If you read almost any, there is at least one exception I'm aware of, but almost any fungicide label, there is a rate range. And the standard use rate is never the full use rate, with the exception of maybe a product or two that only have one rate on the label. But most products will give you a range of rates. And we've seen in testing. We've seen, anecdotally in overlap areas in fields or field borders where you're overlapping with your neighbor. If you're both spraying fungicide, drifting on each other, and you're both getting a higher rate as a result of that, there's some magic that's happening there. And if you've ever seen that magic on a field border, that magic's actually fairly consistent. I had a trial I did in 22. So after 21, and
the really bad times.
and you and I walked fields in 21, and we're tripping through fields in corn in 21. So in 22, we did a lot of trial work that needed to be done in 21. Well, 22 was a low disease pressure year, so we didn't really get to see what it would have looked like if we'd have done that in 21. But even though it was a low disease pressure year, I had a trial that I did with a high boy. We applied 8, 10, and 12 ounces of
probably straight Delaro.
That would have been Delaro at that time. So, and then we came back 3 weeks later with it was actually more like 17 or 18 days, because they said the plane won't be here in 3 weeks. So if you're going to do this, it's going to be today.
Now or never.
Now or never. So I picked now.
So that's 3 weeks.
So they screwed up my timing, but I'll get over that someday. So we came back with a plane and sprayed. So obviously the high boy sprayed with the rows. We sprayed crossways with the plane in the middle of the field. So what I ended up with was 8 by itself, 8 followed by 8, 10 by itself, 10 followed by 8, 12 by itself, 12 followed by 8.
Okay.
And then we took that to yield. And the highest yielding plot, 2 highest yielding plots, were 12 and 12 followed by 8. The cool part was 12 by itself beat 8 plus 8. Yeah. That's some good ROI there, because I had 2 trips and 16 ounces that lost to 1 trip and 12 ounces. And that was the first time that I kind of an aha moment for me that, if things are really, in 21, the best would have been 12 followed by 8.
Yeah.
Guaranteed.
Yeah.
In 22, we didn't have enough disease pressure to make 12 followed by 8 look good. We just spent more money and got the same yield, which we try to avoid that. But the fact that 12 by itself beat 8 plus 8 was kind of cool. Now, I think if we'd have had more disease pressure, the second later shot maybe would have made a difference. Yeah. So the reason it came out that way was because we didn't have, a lot of disease that year. But that whole put on as much as you can afford and then add a little more. I had a guy that accidentally, can't do this legally. He was spraying headline amp, which I think 14.4 is the max rate of amp. He accidentally mixed up a load of Delaro Complete at 14.4.
Oh, I bet that looked good.
That was really good corn.
But we cannot.
We can't advocate that. It just a happy accident was really good corn. So again, there is some magic there. And I think when a lot of the testing was done initially on fungicides, nobody thought anybody would ever spend that much money. And so it wasn't really well tested. And I know nobody wants to spend that much money today, but I do think that you get what you pay for with certain things in life, and fungicides would be one of those. And the better products, have more benefits, and a higher rate of any product has more benefits. And especially there's a lot of interest in, and CP reps cover your ears. There's a lot of interest in guys, saying, how can I use this generic? Because it's a lot cheaper. If you're using anything cheap, full rate every time, or don't use it would be my recommendation. And the full rate of a good product will be better than a full rate of a generic product. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think I feel like we've kind of gone off on a fungicide tangent, but
yeah, it's a little early for that, but
here we are.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when you think about that, I get the question of, if you're going to do 2 applications, do you use your generic first or second? That sometimes I get that as well.
No.
I think that your philosophy should be to protect the most up front instead of trying to, follow up with another one. It makes the most sense. Protect it as much as you can up front. And that's why the higher rate, I'm a proponent of that. And if you're going to use 2 different ones, use your really good one first.
Yes.
And then if you I would still like you to use a good one. If you have enough pressure that you need something, you
Right.
probably still want a good one. But
well, I mean, I think in many things in life, there's this desire that the cheap, easy way will work just as well.
that rarely.
It's not going to happen that way,
No.
you know. So there's a reason those products are cheaper. And if you're in a low disease pressure environment and you know you get a little lucky, the cheap product might be just as good as the expensive one, but it's not going to be that way consistently. So just be aware of that. Don't delude yourself into thinking that well, this I've used all those products 15 years ago when they were the premium products, and at that time they were the best there was. But that's not the case anymore.
Yeah. There's very little technology that from 15 years ago that we're still utilizing that hasn't been upgraded.
Right.
And
right.
I think it's the same. We're not using the same hybrids or the same phone or
Right.
the same.
I had a BlackBerry 15 years ago, I think.
I did too. I really liked it. I felt pretty special.
Yeah. I don't think you'd like it if it came back today.
No.
So, all right. So let's get back on topic here. So we did kind of go down a fungicide bunny trail, but that's what we do here, and we hope you learned something from it. So let's talk about soybean populations. I know you love soybeans. That's
they're my
secret passion of Rachel's is soybeans. She's actually a quasi soybean hater.
A guy called me and asked me if I was even the right person to ask about soybeans because he never talked to me about them before.
Well, he at least he knows you.
Knew,
yeah. That's nice. Okay, so we soybean seeding rates have trended down over the years. I planted 120 on my own personal farm this year, and that's 15-inch row straight, no till, no vertical tillage, just putting those poor little things into standing corn stalks. In the middle of April, we planted a lot of beans on our farm the week before Easter, which turned out to be kind of a tough time to plant because April for the most part was cold. March was warm. And so if you look at since March 1 heat unit accumulation, at one point in time, we were above normal. But if you look just from April 15th on, we certainly are not above normal for heat unit accumulation. And I think in particular, our no-till soils stayed really cool because, for no-till to warm up, you need heat. Sunlight by itself with no heat doesn't particularly warm a soil that's covered with corn stalks.
It's hitting the corn stalks
because it's all the heat energy in sunlight is being reflected by the corn stalks, and that is a big component to why the corn came up better than the beans, because corn being planted primarily on bean stubble, and we do more tillage on our corn typically, so you've got a more bare, darker soil absorbing sunlight energy. And I think a lot of days in mid and late April, if you'd have stuck a soil thermometer in that row of corn in a cornfield, it would have been 5 to 10 degrees warmer than putting the soil thermometer where the soybean seed was in that cornstalk field. And I think that was a huge factor. So we do have a lot of challenged soybean stands. Some people tried to blame the variety. Some people have tried to blame seed quality. Some people have tried to blame the herbicide program. Some people have tried to blame seed treatments. There's been a lot of blaming going on. The cold soils and the weather are the primary culprits. Now you add in all those other factors that could influence things here and there. And, there are differences in emergence and varieties. I can't say that I've had, a consistent bean or a consistent herbicide program or a consistent anything other than no-till has been the one consistent thing.
15-inch no-tills.
Yeah. Well, and 30-inch row beans push better, and the planter typically, and you don't ever end up planting in a cornstalk row either, typically, when you're putting 30-inch beans no-till, because you just plant them in the middle. And I've got some trials going on our farm where we alternated. So we made a round with our 15-inch row planter, and we made a round with our 30-inch row planter at the same time. And I could take you to those fields today. The 30-inch rows are, nearly perfect, and the 15s are pretty sketchy. So
I believe that. So
the guys, and I love no-till, and I kind of quasi hate 30-inch row beans. So once again, this is hard on me because the things I like aren't working as well. And that's, that frustrates me because I don't want to change.
Yeah.
I like what I like.
I think though, I'm sure that we'll get into the discussion on what to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Beans, it's not very often that I go out to beans and I'm like, gosh, these things are beautiful right now, this time of year.
Right.
They're always gonna look ugly and struggle, and your 15-inch no-till probably is gonna be fine.
Yeah.
It's just
I've got some fields that have they're and this is the seed treatment and the herbicide and some of this stuff, the little bit of brown tinge that you get on them. They're not even, the poor things aren't even green. They're kind of off green because they're just, it's cold, it's tough. You got a lot of residue. They've struggled. They got a little bit of this and that working on them, and a nice little shower early next week and some warm weather is just what the doctor ordered to perk those up. But for you guys that have been no-tilling for a long time, you probably remember this. The recommendation of no-till beans back in the day was, and this sounds like really bad agronomy, but it generally worked out okay, was plant your beans, don't look at them for a month. And the only thing you need to change with that is, if you're going to plant beans in early April, you might want to wait 5 or 6 weeks before you look at them, because sometimes a month just isn't enough. These, April 19th beans, which is a pretty bad day to plant beans this year. Those beans are not quite a month.
Yeah.
Pretty close.
Yeah. So I think it's the 15th.
It's the 15th.
Yep.
That's reminds me. It's my son Cole's birthday today.
Oh,
happy birthday, Cole. Yeah. So I called him this morning, wished him happy birthday, and I was going to take him out to dinner tonight and ask him if he was busy. And he's got 2 pickup trucks and a semi in the shop that have to be done by Friday. So he's not really celebrating his birthday too much because he's busy. So he said if he had a really good day, maybe he'd have time to go out to eat with Dad tonight.
Maybe celebrate the birthday and the pickups and the trucks being done.
Yes.
That might feel better.
And I didn't ask. I don't know if he's got to be done by Friday because he's promised they've been done by Friday, or he's got plans for the weekend. He's going to be gone. I don't know. Could be either one. But anyway, happy birthday, Cole. So he's 24, by the way. So I'm my oldest is 24, and I'm that makes me old too. So, or feel old anyway. You guys that have grandkids that are 24 are not sympathetic at all. I understand towards me there. But so back to soybean population. So I'm just going to ask you, Rachel, and I know this. It depends soil type and
that's our favorite
such.
Answer.
It is. What's your minimum? What will you live with 15-inch row or any row space? Because row spacing really doesn't matter on what you need for population. It does influence how good they come up, unfortunately, sometimes. But whether you're drilling 15-inch, 20-inch, 30-inch, 36 if you want, my population recommendations really don't change based on row spacing as far as what you need. So what's your minimum number you'll try to get a guy to leave?
So I'm really happy at 80.
Yes.
70 most of the time I'm okay with. Then after 70, I get a little bit nervous, especially I start asking about weed control or weed management. If they tell me this is a problem field, my number is going to go up a little bit more, and I'm probably going to want to be in that 80. But 70, I'm usually okay with.
So
a lot of times.
So I'll ask you what the farmer asked me is. So Rachel, you tell me 70 is enough. Why am I planting 140 if 70 is enough?
Stop planting that many.
Good answer. So I did have a call the other day. The guy's planting 120. He's got 100, and he's not really happy with that. I'm like, well, that's cutting it pretty close, because if you think 100's a little thin, you're probably going to have to plant more than 120 to consistently have more than 100. But yeah, I actually, I look at a lot of stands that are in that 80 to 100 range that somebody's a little grumbly about because they planted enough to have more than that. So I get it. The math doesn't seem to be working in their mind, but I think unintentionally they've ended up with a perfect stand. Yeah. I think the perfect stand of soybeans is probably somewhere between 80 and 100. And I agree. Rachel's answer, this is a little bit surprising that you get 2 agronomists that kind of agree on something. I'm only more comfortable with 80 than I am with 70 because most farmers are more comfortable with 80 than they are 70. I don't know that 80 is better than 70, but 70 is kind of my number. And I too agree with Rachel that you could probably go below 70 and be fine, depending on the soil, depending on the bean, depending on weed pressure, depending on this, that, and the other. But when you dip below 70, that starts to be a little bit risky for Rachel and I to talk you into leaving that, and that's something that I don't do a lot of, frankly. Little inside baseball secret here for agronomists is the first thing you need to do when you're talking with a customer about replant is gauge what they want to do. Yes. And then agree with it, and that way you can't be wrong.
Yeah.
So just so you know how that works, because we won't deny you doing a replant just because Rachel and I don't think you need to. If you qualify for replant from us, you can do what you want and replant that field. But my concern is, and this I think is probably happening a lot this year. Somebody can't stand to look at 70 or 80,000, so they go out there with 100 or 120 and plant into it, and they think they're going to kill half the ones that are up with the planter, which it is amazing how little damage you do dragging a 15-inch row planter through a field of 15-inch row beans. Sprayer tracks seem to cause more damage than replanting does. It's just crazy. You might kill 10% of those beans, maybe. But most of them are going to survive. And actually, a planter is more effective than a rotary hoe at releasing some of the ones that are, can't get out of the crusted soil.
More will come up.
So you'll get a few more up because of dragging the planter through the field. And, every field that's averaging 80 has areas that you've got 120,000 plants when you replant it. And almost nobody's willing to make a jigsaw puzzle out of their field and take the time and energy and frustration to just do the thin spots. You're just going to redo the field, and you're going to end up with 200,000 plants somewhere in that field. Those are going to lodge. Those are going to potentially have white mold. Those are going to yield less. So I actually think what happens in a lot of cases, maybe 10% of the field, you are increasing your yield potential. In maybe 40% of the field, you're neutral. And maybe in 30, 40, 50% of the field, you're actually losing yield because you're too thick now. So I think there's a lot of situations where we replant fields, and it probably costs us money to do it in the end because we're not gaining yield on as many acres as we're losing yield on. And so even if you're getting paid by crop insurance to do it, and even if you're getting free seed to do it, it might not be improving your ROI to do it. So keep in mind when you're evaluating those stands of beans, 2 beans per foot in 15-inch rows is 70,000. And 2 sick little beans per foot in 15-inch rows in heavy no-till corn stalks looks like words that we aren't supposed to say here on public YouTube. It looks bad. Yeah. And really, if I'm going across the field, like riding across on a side-by-side or something, if you can halfway row 15-inch no-till beans, you got enough. Because when you get below 60, you can't really even see the row there. And there's a lot of beans that are thin, but I've had multiple growers over the years tell me that their best field of beans ended up being one that they almost replanted because they couldn't stand to look at it because it was kind of thin. So I think thin beans are better, and you can't always plant 100 and get 80, but if you could plant 100 and get 80, I'd plant 100. But sometimes it helps to have a few extra. I don't really like using a lot of extra to get a stand because typically, and this year's kind of a little bit of an anomaly, these thin stands are oddly uniform this year in my experience.
Yeah.
I don't think I've been in a bean field yet where there were areas where there's nothing.
No, there's not the holes.
Yeah, there's no holes
but
out
they
there.
haven't been crazy wet.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah, holes come from saturated, ponded situations typically. So it's, the fields are, varying from 60 to 100.
I feel like that's fair.
Usually,
Yeah.
and you could walk away from that and not be awful. That 60 spot, yeah, that's a little thin. Would it yield better if you could magically plant 50 into the 60? Would that be better? Probably. But while you're doing that, you're also planting 50 into the 100, and that's not going to be better. That might actually be worse. And so you're just not really gaining much by. And I got a great story for this from a former colleague. I've told this story many times. People are going to get tired of hearing me tell this story, but he had a field that was averaging 90. And this is back a few years ago when we weren't as comfortable with 90 as we are today. He agreed. He said, if it was a uniform 90, I wouldn't want to do anything. But he had some pretty big areas where he was getting down to 60. And he just couldn't stand the thought of leaving those areas at 60. And they weren't well defined enough. He couldn't just go plant the thin spots. He was just going to put an extra 100 in the whole field. And I can't remember if he did, I think about 100,000 is what he replanted with. And I said, well, do me a favor. I said, leave some where you don't do anything. And so he did. He left a couple rounds out there, and then he cut the field on an angle. And he's got a yield monitor, and he's got it calibrated. And he said, and he admitted this to me afterwards. A lot of guys wouldn't tell me this, but he's a friend and an honest person. And so he told me this. He says, every time I'm cutting on an angle, every time I come up to that spot where I didn't replant anything, the yield monitor went up. And when I came out the other side of it, it went back down. And so he actually figured he lost 5 bushel of yield by planting 100,000 beans into that poor stand of beans. And if you've ever raised seed beans, sometimes seed beans, you only get so many, and you just got to kind of do the math, and you do the math. It's like, okay, I can plant 112,000, and then I'm going to be out of seed because that's all we give you. So guys that have grown seed beans know that, thin beans do well. Our research trials, I did a plot up here at Elliott's yesterday. We had a little extra room. So we took the last 4 passes, did 60, 100, 140, and 180. And, we'll see what happens. We did a trial at Cal-Al's site at Auburn a few years ago where he went down to 40 in 30-inch rows in a population trial, and 40 did yield the least, but it was only 7 bushel, and they made 83.
That's all.
Yeah, yep. Didn't get to 90, but yeah, pretty good. It's 40. That's a corn population.
Yeah.
Yep,
there is overlap there.
And it's the beans are amazing. I agree with Rachel. You get. I left some spots one year where, I was probably under 40. They were wet areas. They'd ponded. There were very few beans that survived. That was a weed patch when I cut the beans. I didn't have enough plants there to maintain a canopy. So, somewhere below 60 is where we start to lose weed control. And that's important too. So we gotta, if nothing else, we gotta have enough plants out there to keep the water hemp down. Yeah. So that's probably enough on the soybean replant decision. Let's talk about corn that's leafing out underground. So it's every year is weird. We never know what's going to happen. You can't predict. We talked about our risk management tool on planting, and so we're trying to come up with tools that would help you identify, is this a good day to plant or not? But it's risky to not plant on a day that you could have been planting.
Right.
And we've had a lot of perfect soil conditions this year. There hasn't been a lot of stuff mudded in this year. Now, I will say some of those no-till soybean fields that got planted the week before Easter,
you can find it. You can
still see you're stretching it a bit to say that was fit, and you can definitely tell the parts of the field that were fit. You got a good stand there. The parts of the field that, Rachel and I might not call you out on this, but as we're walking around out there, we can tell it was a tad wet when it got planted, So just so you know, we know, even if we don't say. But anyway, by and large, especially on corn, soils were fit, and we still have a few problems. So planting into a fit soil is a really good start, but it's not a guarantee of success. And the most common denominator that causes lack of success is a rain right after you plant. Even if it's only 3/10, if it's 3 inches, that's worse. But if you get rained out of the field, even if it's just 2 or 3/10, and even if the soil was perfect when it rains, you always bring up some moisture with the planter. And if that soil doesn't have a chance to dry out well after planting before it rains, that's not an ideal situation.
Bad stories always start with, I was trying to beat a rain.
Yes.
I feel like anytime I hear that, I know it's probably not going to be good.
Yep.
Whatever follows.
Yep. And so we've identified, I would say there was a lot of soybeans got planted like April 18th, 19th, Good Friday, right ahead of Easter, and those have all struggled. There wasn't as much corn getting planted at that time, and the corn that was planted at that time probably fared better than the beans did. But lately, and this is catching some people off guard, and you may not have even noticed this yet, the 29th and 30th of April have emerged as kind of some voodoo dates for corn. And here the last few days, we've had several calls on stands of corn that are not perfect. And generally, when you start digging, the ones that are missing have leafed out underground. And that's a phenomenon that, is caused by numerous different things potentially. You got a good picture of that?
I was going to say I might. You keep talking.
Yeah.
I'll see if I got yesterday.
And so I've had calls on multiple different hybrids. So it's everything can be influenced by genetics. So I'm not going to say there aren't hybrids out there that are more likely to leaf out underground than others, but it's probably more condition related. Yeah, Rachel's got her nice picture there. So there are. She's doing a better job of holding that up in the right spot. I'm always moving around trying to find where the camera is, and she just went right there. Ladies touch.
She's just a professional.
So there's a crust is probably the first thing that always gets blamed. Well, a lot of these soils aren't particularly crusted. The rain that came right after that 29th, 30th planting window was usually not a hard rain. So there's a little bit of a crust out there, but not a bad one. The soil's not hard. It's still fairly crumbly. Herbicides can be implicated in leafing out underground. If you get sunlight down to the coleoptile spike as it's coming up. So if your seed trench isn't closed well, if you've got residue hairpin down in the seed trench, if it was a little bit cloddy, and some of the worst leafing out underground, this is kind of a weird scenario, but this will cause a disaster every time. Let's say you've got a spike that's coming up through some clods, and let's say it's about 3/4 of an inch from the surface, and let's say there's enough sunlight getting down in between the clods that spike, it thinks it's up, because when it sees the sun, it thinks it's up, so it leafs out. And then let's say you get a nice rain that night, and it melts all those clods together. None of that's coming up. That I've seen some real disasters from that. Kind of a weird situation, but it can happen. A little bit of insect feeding on that spike can cause it to leaf out underground. Cold weather exacerbates all the above, and we had some really cold weather. I think there was a night that was like 37 or something.
Yeah, probably further north it was even
in that window.
Yeah. So
we had a borderline frost event there in that window. And if you get, I was at one of the fields I was in, we had a row that I don't know if we had a stick jammed in the row cleaner or something was not set right, but it was trenched, noticeably trenched more than every other row. That row had 50% of the plants leafed out underground. It was a disaster. 24-row planter. The other 23 rows, maybe 5% of the plants leafed out underground. I mean, it was dramatic. And you could tell, even though we didn't have a 3-inch rain, the water had collected in that trench.
Yeah.
And when you move the herbicide from 30 inches either direction into that trench, and you've got a moat on top of your seed that's water and herbicide, and it's cold, and you just, that's just a
pretty concentrated.
Yes,
yeah.
that's awful,
Yeah.
you know. And that one row, I mean, we're not going to tear up the field because 1 out of 24 rows is a disaster. But heaven forbid, if your field looked like that one row, or every row looked like that row, that field would have got tore up. And so it just seems like something with that. It's a lot of different herbicide programs, so not blaming the herbicide program. Any corn grass herbicide, and there's a lot of different flavors of corn grass herbicide. All of your acid analyte chemistry, that's one of the things that it can contribute to. But the cold weather is probably, if it was the herbicide, it was only because the weather was so cold, the plant couldn't metabolize the herbicide that it was absorbing. So it all goes back to the weather conditions, as it generally always does. But hopefully, if you got 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% of your plants leaf out underground, yeah, that's frustrating. Yeah, you wonder why that's happening, but it's certainly not going to put you in a replant situation. But if you're seeing that, that's probably the planting window that you're in based on what we've seen. I haven't yet made a replant recommendation on corn, but it is May 15th. We are still in theory close to 100% yield potential. I wouldn't live with a terrible stand when you could replant on May 15th. Now, my weather forecast today says it's going to rain like 4.5 inches next Tuesday and Wednesday. I'll believe that when I see it. But if we do get some big heavy rains early next week, this weekend will turn into a bad planting window. So I guess it's always. I have a lot of respect for people who never second guess Mother Nature.
I do that all the time.
Me too. I can't help myself, and it burns you almost every time. Because if you do something because you think it's going to rain, or you don't do something because you think it's not going to rain, or you modify your plan because you think you know what the weather's going to do, almost never works out for you. So do what you got to do, and Mother Nature may help you, Mother Nature may hurt you. But in my experience, if you start changing what you think you want to do based on what you think might happen, that gets frustrating, because it almost never, you end up kicking yourself. It's like, oh, well, I should have just stuck to my plan, because when I modified my plan because I was thinking about the weather, and then you don't get the weather that you think you're going to get, and then you wish you would have stuck to your original plan. So you've been there, done that. So.
Yeah. So one thing I would add, my territory, I've been seeing, you said 29 and 30. I've been seeing some of the issues on the 28th.
Okay.
So probably just a difference in geography, and we were colder,
Sure.
as you move further north.
Sure.
But
yeah.
Heather and I were out looking at some, and I think the 28th was actually worse than the 29th. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. And neither of those were bad. It was just, we were finding sporadic ones here and there.
I mean, the April 10th corn is perfect. And so I've got some even earlier than that corn, and I think when you've seen when you've seen how perfect that stuff is, and you listen to your agronomist, and late April should be better, and it's worse. It's like, well, what the heck, And so it's I think the corn that we've had a lot of different planting windows for corn. We had some of you started before the 15th of April on corn, and some people hadn't. And then there was a lot of stuff that got planted, a couple different times in April. And then a lot of people finished up last week. And that stuff is probably going to have the easiest life of all of it, hopefully. And, should be really, really, really good shape. It's if you could plant everything into moisture in a good seed bed and get it up before it rains on it, that's wonderful. We don't get that luxury very often. Probably easier to do in Kansas.
The moisture part might be a little,
that's right.
Sketchy.
They sometimes don't plant because it's too dry, and they're waiting for moisture. You believe that? Yeah, it's just weird. So anyway, and if you are, if you do have to replant or you are finishing up planting, you might need to find some notches on your planter that you don't use very often, because you might want to be 2.5 or 3 inches deep to make sure that you're in moisture, and recognize that, that there's not a lot of moisture close to the surface. And when you work it, it's going to dry out, and it'll dry out more after you plant it. And a day like today is going to really, really dry stuff out. So I actually hope we catch some rain early next week. I don't particularly want 4.5 inches, but an inch or two of rain widespread would be really nice to activate some herbicide and kind of help some stuff that is struggling a little bit. We haven't had a lot of showers to soften up hard soils and crusts, and so we haven't gotten the frequent rains that we sometimes do that save you and keep you from needing to replant or help stuff get through a hard soil. Let's talk about bugs a little bit. So I kind of ruined Rachel's evening last night. I sent her a picture of a stink bug that was crawling around in the truck with me when I've been scouting some fields, and that's along with and I've been asked not to use the A word anymore, but some other critter. We were hoping that a little bit harder winter last year, and maybe we'd see a little bit less of this stuff. So the stink bug pressure that we had last year was troublesome. Kind of went unnoticed in a lot of cases. I think there were a lot of plants that kind of turned into a weed, and somebody probably blamed something else for that. But that's often when you get that corn plant at, you're walking that field at, like maybe after you spray your herbicide, doing some scouting, you start seeing those plants that are kind of growing weird, kind of growing like a bush, and they kind of look like the leaves of a pineapple. Look like a little corn bush. Those were probably fed on by a stink bug, and when they probe into I know you all know what a stink bug looks like, but Rachel showed a picture earlier, so you can talk about your cutworm story.
Oh, I did find a couple cutworm. There were actually 2 on the same plant, which is if you can find that consistently, that's a bad sign. Mm-hmm. There's your stink bug.
There's my stink bug.
Yeah.
So there's lots of different colors of stink bugs. I don't know if that's an immature green or if that's a brown or what that is. Kind of a greenish brown, but they all do the same thing. They probe in through the side of the corn plant, and they're feeding down close to the ground, and that's where the growing point is. And if they ding that growing point, that plant's and they're also releasing some toxins into the plant as they're feeding, and they'll ruin a corn plant and turn it into people talk about plants that are a leaf or 2 behind being a weed. That's a bit of an exaggeration. They're going to have a smaller ear, but they're not truly a weed. Stink bug plants are literally weeds, because they are not, they're not going to die, but they're not going to make an ear either. So your field would be better off if they would all die, because they at least wouldn't be wasting water and nutrients and sunlight.
Yeah. Before I cause panic with my cutworm, let me finish on I found 2 on the same plant, and it was not a no-till field. It was not a cover crop, all the things that we normally think. It was the middle of a corn field that had been tilled. But that was the only one I found in the last several days. And I've been walking around digging up plants that are leafing out. And
right.
So I'm really not that worried. When I looked, there's an iPipe is an organization with academics, and they track, you've probably been on that, where you see the map where they track significant flights, and there's no real significant flights showing up. There was one in, I want to say maybe Menard County on the map, and it wasn't really even wasn't as bad as it could be. So I think it's pretty sporadic, but it's possible they're out there in small numbers. Yeah. So if you do have no-till or next to waterways, cover crop, that kind of thing, that's where you might start scouting for them.
Mm-hmm. I had a good bean leaf beetle feeding picture I got the other day. That's actually a quite good stand. Look at all that corn residue, and look at all those beans.
That's pretty impressive.
That's a really good stand of beans. The bean leaf beetle are appreciating that, because there's lots of beans there to eat. So a lot of our seed treatments have insecticide, have a neonic insecticide of one flavor or another. We have stayed with the imidacloprid in our soybean Acceleron mix because it's the best product on bean leaf beetle. But even if you're using a high rate of the best product, if your beans have been in the soil for 6 weeks, that's, the level of that protection in that plant is starting to diminish. If you're not using an Acceleron, high rate imidacloprid soybean seed treatment, you can expect to see more bean leaf beetle feeding normally. And those products are going to wear off even quicker because the insecticide in those other products is not as good as what's in our Acceleron mix. But that's actually not enough feeding that you would think about spraying the field. I mean, I think 30% defoliation is actually the threshold for pulling a trigger on an application.
Have you ever made that recommendation?
I've never. No,
okay, no, I haven't either.
I haven't. I mean, there's been guys that have sprayed fields for them because they couldn't stand to look at 10% defoliation, but I've never seen, well, other than like armyworm or something a lot more voracious.
There was like a couple of years ago, they were really bad. Yep.
So I have actually never made a recommendation to treat for bean leaf beetle vegetative feeding. Pod feeding maybe on a late generation would.
There was, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago in part of my territory, it was really bad, and I did make those recommendations. But early season, I don't think I've ever seen it bad enough to worry.
But that is that is one distinguishable difference. If your soybean seed treatment is not using a high rate of imidacloprid, you're going to let more bean leaf beetle feeding occur. So if you don't like looking at that, you might want to look at using the best product you can for bean leaf beetle protection, and they're always going to be in the earliest planted beans. And it used to be only 1 or 2 crazy guys were planting beans early. We've all turned into crazy early bean planting people. So that's spreading them out more because, there's millions of acres of early planted soybeans. They used to really go to town on the, 2 fields of early planted soybeans, but now every field of bean is an early planted bean field. So they don't really get concentrated on just a field or 2 here or there. But that might be another insect that you see. Can't really think of anything. I've seen a lot of grubs digging in fields too. So don't know that that's really going to be a problem. You can always find grubs. They're always there. You got to have them in really, really high numbers for them to do much damage. But things like that, your early season insect pests, cutworms, bean leaf beetles, stink bugs, grubs, the wireworms and things like that are all active now. We're not into I haven't seen any fireflies yet, which is kind of our first signal that there might be some rootworm eggs hatching. So we don't know what the rootworm pressure is going to be this year. It has been, trending up in recent years, but we still see very, very low rootworm pressure on first year corn in Rachel and I's part of the world. Yeah. She's got a little heavier pressure than I do because she does get up there close to, rootworm hell. Yeah. Jim Donnelly's area. We're always Jim. Not as far. Jim loves it when he's associated with bad rootworm and tar spot. Yeah,
poor Northern Illinois.
Yeah. Northern Illinois just always takes it on the chin. So, anything else that you were wanting to talk about?
The other thing that I'll mention that I think we will probably see before your next episode is rapid growth syndrome. I saw as I was driving in, there was a field that was probably V4, V5. I was planting pretty early, and it was kind of starting to get that look. I tried to find some out here. I drove out to where you put in your crown rot early, and I couldn't quite find it, but it has that look where it's going to start growing. It's warm. We're going to get the heat. We're going to start seeing that. And bottom line is, it's not really a concern, but it does look funny.
Right.
And I think we will see it.
And what Rachel's talking about is that the whorl does not unfurl properly. It kind of wraps and stays tight. And as that plant's growing, it can't, the leaves get caught, and then it starts to kind of grow over like in a shepherd's crook kind of look to it. And
I took a picture on my other phone.
Okay.
I was looking and I thought, where to go? It wasn't, this isn't the best example because I think there's something else could have been going on with this one, but kind of you see where it wrapped up there.
It's got a leaf that's pinched, and
I think that was something else, but that's what I'm talking about.
And we call it rapid growth syndrome because it typically occurs when we've got perfect growing conditions. You've got ideal moisture, it's hot, sunlight. When that corn plant just takes off, sweet corn does it almost every time. Yeah. So there are genetic differences in that. And one thing that you maybe noticed this before and didn't associate it with rapid growth, but when those plants do unwrap, which they 9 times out of 10, they do unwrap, you'll see scattered yellow leaves sticking up out in the field. And that's been a leaf that's been so tightly wrapped down in the whirl, it didn't know the sun was out. Yeah. And so it wasn't green. And when that plant releases and it opens up, you get a couple yellow leaves, and you can just see them sticking up out in the field. It's kind of a striking look, and that's when you know that plant has gotten unwrapped, and those leaves are going to green up, and it doesn't hurt a thing. It just kind of freaks people out, makes people think of herbicide injury, and we talk about buggy whip plants and corn leafing out underground. Well, when it does that, they emerge kind of gnarled up, knotted up, and connection is unstable. So that probably means this episode is over. We just don't know it.
All right.
But anyway, we are an hour plus, so okay, I guess it is time to let you all go. We'll be back or at least I will be. Probably won't be with Rachel. She doesn't want to do this every 2 weeks, but in 2 weeks. Which Heather, what's the date on 2 weeks from today?
Oh, jeez.
29th. Yeah. So May 29th, we'll be back with our next episode of Ask the Agronomist, and appreciate those of you who took the time to join this morning. And everybody stay safe, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Take care.
See you.